Occupying the southeastern edge of the Arabian Peninsula, 7 traditional emirates spanning from the Rub al-Khali Desert to the western Hajar Mountains, united into an extraordinary federation. When Britain announced its withdrawal from the Gulf in 1971, the rulers of Abu Dhabi and Dubai first established a bilateral union for mutual protection, and then extended invitations to the neighboring emirates to join the alliance, creating what is today known as the United Arab Emirates. Spanning across the eastern outcrop of the Arabian Peninsula as a jagged crescent, the image of this union is often reduced to just a lot of sand and empty space. While this perception isn't entirely inaccurate, around and underneath the endless sand dunes and salt flats, there are a lot more geographical nuances, which we'll have a closer look at in this video. Since it is the most prominent feature of the Emirates, we'll start our journey in the Rub al-Khali Desert before moving along the coast to then finish our journey in the eastern mountains at the Gulf of Oman. The most striking and omnipresent feature of the Arabian Peninsula is certainly the Arabian Desert, whose southernmost and most desolate section is the Rub al-Khali, Arabic for the empty quarter. The vast expanse remains virtually devoid of life, both in its Saudi heartland and where it extends across the border into the Emirates, which explains why so little attention has been paid to precisely demarcating the border between the two countries in this region. The Treaty of Jeddah, drafted with Saudi Arabia shortly after the UAE's establishment, was intended to formalize the federation's borders. While the parties reached a broad agreement on most territorial claims, significant uncertainties remain, with the UAE maintaining that the final written treaty differed substantially from the verbal agreements reached during the negotiations. Allegedly, the written demarcation shifts the entire boundary 5 to 15 kilometers northeastward in Saudi Arabia's favor, which is why the UAE hasn't ratified the agreement to this day. On first glance, the land in question might seem of little value, were it not for the vast oil deposits found just south of Saudi Arabia's claimed border. Since the 70s, the UAE has tried to get Saudi Arabia back on the negotiating table to address these discrepancies, but not much progress has been made, and it remains a contentious topic between the two nations. Surrounding this Shaiba oil field, now maintained by Saudi Arabia, topographic mapping reveals a dramatic shift in the landscape's relief compared to the otherwise monotonous desert, with up to 300-meter tall dunes towering over the salt pans. To an even bigger surprise, the northern boundary of this dune field is actually bustling with life and development that seemingly defies the region's harsh natural constraints. Spanning a 120-kilometer-long crescent around the giant sandbox, an ancient aquifer allows for date palm plantations, which has led to a population explosion in recent decades. The Liva Oasis has been populated for centuries now, and is actually the home region of Abu Dhabi's ruling family, but only with advancements in well technology has this level of development become feasible here. The excessive growth doesn't come without its downsides though, and today the roughly 4,000 inhabitants, spread over 50 villages, are living well above their means when it comes to the water reserve. An unconfined clay basin, around 110 meters underground, has collected monsoon rains from around 9 to 6,000 years ago, but since then there has been virtually no replenishment of the aquifer. Realizing this discrepancy in the water balance, not wanting to give up on the primary agriculture zone of the country, the Abu Dhabi government is keen on artificially sustaining the aquifer. Massive pipelines have been constructed for this purpose, which channel excess desalinated water from the coastal plants into the hinterland of the UAE, attempting to sustain the water table. Nevertheless, the scale of extraction far outpaces replenishment, and the projection of even more growth in the region makes this project but a token of gesture against the harsh hydrological reality. Beyond the underground aquifers, life is harsh in the Rub al-Khali Desert, with only a handful of plant and animal species able to tolerate the extreme aridity. Summer temperatures in the desert frequently reach highs of 48 degrees Celsius or 113 degrees Fahrenheit, and regular sharky winds in spring and autumn suspend sand and dust into kilometer-tall towers that sweep across the desert. Among the few mammals adapted to these conditions is the Arabian Oryx, once hunted to near extinction and now making a steady recovery, with a large protected reserve along the desert's outskirts. Most of the UAE's fauna is not found on land, but rather along the sandy shoreline and surrounding the many islands in the Persian Gulf. The high temperatures, which make the land barely habitable, are also threatening the ocean health. but many hundreds of species have adapted to the water temperature exceeding 36 degrees Celsius on a regular basis. Especially in front of the coast of Abu Dhabi, 4% of the global seagrass meadows can be found, covering nearly all areas of the nearshore seabed. As the preferred habitat of the dugong and hundreds of fish species, they also provide a substantial carbon sink in regional soil. Complementing these underwater meadows, the UAE's coastline is also distinguished by extensive mangrove forests that are locally known as kurm. These salt-tolerant trees, covering over 4,000 hectares nationally, create dense coastal woodlands that serve as nurseries for marine life and natural barriers against coastal erosion. Like many marine habitats though, the changing climate and warming waters are challenging the balance of this biosphere, but the mangroves and seagrass meadows are far from the most threatened coastal habitat of the UAE. This unfortunate status goes to the coral reefs scattered along the UAE's shoreline and around its Gulf Islands. When mapping of coral reefs started in the 1960s, the coastal waters of the UAE were renowned for their dense reefs spanning hundreds of hectares, and high percentage of alive corals exceeding 60%. As time progressed and the oceans warmed, however, the habitats have been decimated, and in 1998 they experienced another devastating blow. During an extreme El Niño event, the Persian Gulf temperatures reached unprecedented levels, exceeding 37 degrees for extended periods, which led to 70% of the remaining corals expel their symbiotic algae in a process called coral bleaching. To counteract this ecological collapse, the UAE has launched an ambitious coral restoration project, installing artificial reef modules along much of the northwestern coastline. These structures are seeded with coral fragments from the most heat-resistant species, cultivated in specialized nurseries in the UAE. While these restoration efforts represent genuine attempts to address the environmental damage, they also serve a broader strategic interest that extend beyond ecological conservation. The discussion of the UAE geography would be incomplete without examining the oil wealth that fundamentally transformed this region, and of course the story of how they are trying to diversify away from this finite resource. Starting in the 1950s, the first major oil deposits were discovered in the desert of Abu Dhabi, and its revenue has almost instantly revolutionized the urban landscape and influence of the UAE. The wealth has been used for ambitious infrastructure projects and lavish skylines, but the government is aware that the oil sources and global needs of oil are finite. Since then, the UAE has spent hundreds of billions of US dollars to diversify the country's industries, with tourism emerging as one of the cornerstones of the strategy, which explains the immense investments put into the coral reefs, for example. Looking at the geographical distribution of global oil reserves reveals just how fortunate the Emirates are positioned on the world map, with nearly 6% of the global oil reserve being contained in the 0.05% of the global land area that the UAE occupies. Most of the oil is located in the Zakum oil field, approximately 80 kilometers offshore of the capital Abu Dhabi, and many smaller oil fields like Shaif, the Bu Hassa, and the Habshan oil fields all also hold significant reserves. To this day, revenues from the oil are surging, and increased focus on improving the value chain of the oil with new capabilities for refineries are increasing the profit margins year over year. Much of this wealth has been channeled into the dramatic urban developments visible across Dubai and Abu Dhabi's skylines and coastlines, establishing these cities as global centers for commerce, tourism, and logistics. However, noteworthy places to visit extend beyond the shimmering skylines and artificial islands of these metropolitan hubs. Opposing the high-tech and modernism, the 5 easternmost Emirates of the Union preserve a lot more of the traditional architecture and Emirati heritage, bringing us to the last stop of our journey around the United Arab Emirates. Rising above Ras Al Khaimah, the easternmost Emirati city on the Persian Gulf, are the Hajar Mountains. Although not particularly tall by global standards, the contrast between them and the endless desert to the west show quite the contrasting stories. Located primarily within Oman, the UAE controls an approximately 80-kilometer wide corridor connecting the Rub al-Khali Desert with the Gulf of Oman, cutting off Musandam from the rest of Oman. Within this stretch, most of the Emirati's land mammal species can be found, including Arabian wolves, foxes, and wildcats that inhabit the higher elevations. Especially in the ungated wilderness zones in the Hatta region and the Wadi Waraya National Park, these predators and their prey live relatively undisturbed in low numbers. With increased elevation, the intense desert heat becomes a lot more tolerable, with these summits and high ridges experiencing a consistent temperature difference of around 10 degrees Celsius compared to the surrounding desert. This also allows some vegetation to establish themselves on the mountain slopes, with cedar, juniper, and other fruit trees occurring naturally at higher elevations. Another factor for their survival is the increased rainfall, which is caused by orographic precipitation. The sharp rise of the mountains from the Gulf of Oman elevates hot and moist air from the Indian Ocean, which cools down and condenses as it crosses the Hajar Mountains, leading to occasional rainfall. While modest by global standard, it is significantly higher than in the Western Desert. There are strong annual variations, but in wet years, precipitation over the mountains can reach up to 400 to 500 millimeters per year, which is comparable to cities like Los Angeles or Madrid. Despite the seasonal rain, rapid evaporation prevents the formations of permanent streams or natural lakes. Instead, the mountains are drained by ephemeral streams called wadis, which flow only during the rainy season. The most significant examples include Wadi B, which drains the northernmost section of the UAE, and Wadi Waraya, which carries water from the central mountains eastward to the Gulf of Oman. Zooming out a bit and adding the interior borders of the UAE onto the map, the Western Hajar Mountains tell another interesting story about their political subdivision. The cluster of borders may appear like a dozen emirates being spread across the mountains, but the situation is a bit more complicated than that. 5 of these 7 emirates are holding territory in the Hajar Mountains, yet not a single one of them forms a continuous area. The most fractured of these is Sharjah, which has its capital next to Dubai along the Persian Gulf, and then controls 5 more disconnected territories in the Hajar Mountains. The most peculiar of these enclaves is the village of Nawa, which is located entirely within Oman, which itself again is an enclave entirely surrounded by the UAE. While these rather chaotic borders appear quite random at first glance, they have quite the reasonable historic background and should have been applied in many more instances across the globe. During the formation and delimitation of the UAE and its subdivisions, tribal affiliations were preserved and respected, creating this now unique mosaic. The emirate with the largest share of the Hajar Mountains is Ras Al Khaimah, spread over 2 extensive areas. Within this mountainous domain stands the region's crown jewel, the Jebel Jais. Standing at 1,934 meters above sea level, it represents the highest point of the Western Hajar range. Although the peak itself lies just across the border in Oman, so the UAE's highest elevation is found on Jebel Jais' western slopes at 1,892 meters, and presents a fitting culmination to our journey through the United Arab Emirates. Looking back down from the ridges of the Hajar Mountains, the uninterrupted view over the flat desert landscape with one of the most challenging climates in the world is a statement of human resilience and adaptability. Transformed by recent oil wealth, the Emirates have undergone unprecedented development, yet their future remains intricately tied to both the finite oil reserves and the region's harsh environmental constraints. As this small nation continues to navigate between the natural limitations and ambitious modernization, its geographical story remains far from complete. If you want to see more mini-documentaries about the most extreme places on planet Earth, I can recommend this video about the geography of the Caucasus Mountains, or watch what YouTube thinks is best for you here. See you in the next one. Cheers.